Welcome, friends, colleagues, and students. I would like to call this webinar to order. My name is Dr. Joseph Richardson, along with Dr. Woody Kessel. I am the co-director of Progress, which stands for Prevent Gun Violence Research, Empowerment, Strategies, and Solutions at the University of Maryland. I am pleased to welcome you to our newest installment of our Distinguished Speaker Series. I think we are all in for a very thought-provoking session featuring the innovative work of Professor Nadine Finigan-Carr from the University of Maryland, Baltimore Center for Violence Prevention. The primary mission of Progress is to reduce firearm-related violence using a multidisciplinary, community-based, and translational science approach to promote public safety and enhance the quality of life for the people of Maryland, the National Capital Region, and the nation. Bringing together the strengths and assets of UMD enables Progress to act for the public's good to prevent gun violence and save lives. To address the issue of gun violence, Progress was launched by the Office of the President as a fearlessly forward initiative and is housed within the College of Behavior and Social Sciences, also known as BSOS, and with the support from the School of Public Health. Before I jump in and dive into our introduction of our dean, which will open this event, just a quick bit of housekeeping rules. Participant microphones and the Zoom chat function are both disabled, but we welcome and encourage you to use the Zoom Q&A function at any time to pose questions, which we will share with our speaker during the Q&A session after her presentation. This meeting is being recorded and will be posted on the Progress website and/or YouTube alongside our previous Distinguished Speakers Series events. We are pleased that our Assistant Dean for Research within BSOS, Dr. Meredith Kleikamp, is here to join us this afternoon to open this event. Dr. Meredith Kleikamp is the Associate Dean for Research in the College of Behavioral and Social Sciences and a professor of sociology at the University of Maryland. She also directs the Center for Research on Military Organization and is a faculty associate of the Maryland Population Research Center. A leading scholar of work, inequality, and institutions, her research examines how the labor market intersects with the military, the prison system, and unions, particularly across racial, ethnic, class, and gender lines. Her primary body of work focuses on the military as a unique labor market institution, exploring why people join, how service shapes their lives, and how veterans navigate the transition to civilian employment. She also studies the economic experiences of military spouses. Dr. Kleicamp's research spans field experiments, survey experiments, large-scale statistical analyses, and in-depth interviews. Her work appears in top journals, including the American Sociological Review, Social Forces, Social Problems, Future of Children, and Armed Forces and Society. She teaches courses on inequality, military sociology, research methods, and an I-Series course on veterans in American society. Dr. Kleikamp, thank you for joining us. The floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Richardson. Thank you to Progress, the entire team, for inviting me to speak for a few minutes today to introduce your speaker. Good afternoon, everyone. As the Associate Dean for Research here in the College of Behavioral and Social Sciences, or BSOS, as you'll hear us repeat over and over, it's a true honor to welcome you and to underscore how seriously our college and our university takes the crisis of gun violence in the United States. The scale of this issue is truly sobering, but gatherings like this one give me real hope that bringing together leaders such as yourselves who are advancing research, practice, and community partnership is exactly the kind of work that's going to move us forward. As Dr. Richardson said, in my own work, I study how major institutions shape people's opportunities and life trajectories. particularly around inequality, employment, and the broader structural conditions that influence life chances. These same forces that I study through the lens of a different institution are deeply connected to the environments in which gun violence takes root. The work that's happening here across BSOS helps to illuminate how these social and economic conditions can either heighten or reduce vulnerability in communities, and why addressing this crisis requires a comprehensive and truly interdisciplinary approach. As the Associate Dean for Research, I want to emphasize something you all probably know quite well. Rigorous, empirically grounded research is indispensable to understanding the drivers of gun violence. There's no way that we can meaningfully intervene without first understanding what undergirds gun violence, the institutional, the economic, the psychological, and community level mechanisms that shape risk. I'm so proud to be part of a university and a college that recognizes gun violence as one of the most pressing grand challenges of our time. As you heard from Dr. Richardson, President Pines launched Progress in 2023 because this epidemic demands coordinated, evidence-driven action. I'm equally proud that my own college, BSOS, plays a central role in that effort. Our faculty and our students are committed to producing research that not only advances knowledge, but supports communities in taking meaningful action. Under the leadership of Drs. Richardson and Kessel, Progress embodies this mission. It brings together education, cutting-edge scholarship, and actionable prevention strategies that are grounded in understanding that community members, locally, regionally, nationally, are our essential partners in this work. Progress is not simply studying gun violence, but working collaboratively to reduce it. This distinguished speaker series is an important extension of that work. By highlighting the groundbreaking research and elevating diverse perspectives, this series ensures that the best available evidence informs the policies and practices that can actually save lives. It reflects the core values of both Progress and BSOS, advancing scholarship, strengthening partnerships, and translating knowledge into impact. We look forward to continuing our work alongside Progress, our campus partners and colleagues across the region and the nation to confront this epidemic with urgency and seriousness with which it demands. And finally, thank you so much to Dr. Nadine Finigan-Carr for participating in this important speaker series. We're so grateful for your leadership and the insights you are going to bring to this conversation today. Thank you so much for being here, and I'll turn the floor back over to Dr. Richardson.
Thank you so much, Dr. Clycan, for sharing this helpful perspective on the complexity of gun violence prevention work. Now I would like to turn the floor over to Progress Co-Director, Dr. Woody Kessel, to introduce our distinguished speaker for today. Woody?
Thanks so much, Joe. This uniquely American tragedy takes the lives of far too many women, children, men, people all across our country. And we're thrilled to participate in trying to advance the science to make this an unreality, if you will. And one of the things that we firmly believe in at Progress is a multidisciplinary approach that emphasizes community. And we have one of the talented people among us in the country, Nadine Finigan-Carr, is going to talk to us today about her work and her background in trying to change this nightmare and save lives. Dr. Finigan-Carr is a distinguished prevention research scientist, and interestingly enough, is the inaugural executive director of the University of Maryland Baltimore Center for Violence Prevention, as Joe mentioned, and this is part of shock trauma in Baltimore. Nadine has an extensive research portfolio that focuses on health behavioral change theories and methods related to chronic disease prevention, injury, and violence, particularly among people of color. Nadine also has an interesting responsibility as Commissioner of Community Relations in Baltimore that gives her a real grounded focus on the successes and challenges that frankly exist um, in the city of Baltimore. We're thrilled and excited that she agreed to share her thoughts and her perspective on racialized media frames in the depiction of gun violence in Maryland. And Nadine, thank you again. And just as a technical one, if you've got questions, please submit them to the Zoom Q&A function so we can see them and we'll share them with Nadine. Again, thank you. Big hugs, Nadine. Thank you for joining us. And we look forward to hearing from you. And I'm sure our audience is excited to hear your thoughtfulness.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Woody. And thank you, Joe and Dr. Camp for all of your kind words. So let's just go ahead and get started. I'm going to share my screen. Oh, it is saying that I do not have permission to share. So I sent a request. So let's see. But yeah. So thank you. As we're waiting for sharing screen, just for those who may have visual or hearing, I am going to try to speak slowly. And for those of you who can't see me due to any sort of visual impairment, I am a light-skinned Black woman with dreadlocks, and my accent is a blend of New Yorker and Caribbean native. And so for those of you who may have difficulty with hearing, I hope that your closed captioning can pick up my accent, because sometimes that happens, that it doesn't pick it up clearly. So let's go ahead and get started. I believe you all can see the screen now. So I will go ahead and begin. Today, as was mentioned, I'll be sharing with you the topic of racialized media frames in the depiction of gun violence here in Maryland. And this particular project that I will be sharing about, it was funded by Progress. And I thank you both for supporting the work that we were doing here in Baltimore on this issue. I'm going to start now with some historical background and some context as we get into this talk. So, first things first, we live currently in the United States of America, and from the point of colonies and colonizations to states and what we now know as the United States of America, this country has been built on the backs of Black, Brown, and Indigenous people. Our history, as a result, is rooted in trauma, and that trauma is a result of structural violence. This has impacted our culture and our identity, from chattel slavery to the forced relocation of First Nations people. The country's political economy has been one that disenfranchises those who are not white. The system of white supremacy has mechanisms which operate to maintain the social order, which includes systematically and structurally the institutions which support that aim. White society overall in this country has ownership of and political power over the capital needed for the livelihood of most people, not only in this country, but actually also on a lot of this planet. So, for example, in Colorado, although slavery was abolished in 1877 there was a loophole in the case of punishment for convicts, which was only amended in 2018, less than a decade ago. When you look at the most recent Equality Index, a calculation of the social and economic status of African Americans relative to whites in this country, it is 73.8%. Rooted in the 3/5 Compromise of 1787, which counted enslaved African Americans as 3/5 of a person for representation in the government. This index would be 100% under full equality here in the United States. The Hispanic index, just as a reference, is 78.8%. And I'm using Hispanic because that's the term for the index, not necessarily the preferred term of most people's. These percentages reflect longstanding intergenerational racial and ethnic disparities, which have been revealed over, I would say, the past decade since prior to and throughout the COVID pandemic leading to today. All of this, however, throughout the hundreds of years has led to trauma, which manifests itself in how Black, Indigenous people of color operate here in the United States. And it is within this backdrop of violence that this study was conceptualized, one where the media drives the narrative about Black people and other people of color in ways that are problematic. So when we think of gun violence, as we know, it's a severe problem here in Maryland. There are roughly 14 deaths per 100,000 residents, according to Everytown Research and Policy. Overall, the counties in central Maryland that tend to experience the highest violent crime rates are those that have the largest populations. So, according to the Report on Crime and Firearms study that was published by GOCAP, there were a total of 2,772 gun crime cases in Maryland just in 2019 to 2020 alone. Of this total, the majority occurred in urban and metropolitan areas of the state. About 62% of those cases occurred in Baltimore City and Prince George's County, with an additional 20% or so of these gun crime cases occurring in Baltimore, Anne Arundel, Worcester, Wycomico, and Washington counties. Now, anxieties about this gun violence have historically been tied to anxieties around race in this country and in this state, and public corruption, with notions of, unfortunately, this idea of inherent criminality tied to certain populations and certain locations of our state. Local media has played a role, unfortunately, in furthering these conceptions, using specific tropes to tell stories about how gun violence happens and how local communities should feel about crime. In fact, there has been analysis that was done throughout the country, throughout this nation, that noted Maryland's unique media environment and how it's contributed to stoking community fears about crime, with media consolidation and particularly aggressive media strategies here around stoking fears of crime and violence, making these concerns especially prevalent for Maryland's and for Maryland's capital region, for Baltimore and Maryland's capital region. Now, while these factors are agreed upon by many parties, there have not been many in-depth analyses of the representations of gun violence in local media throughout the state. Indeed, the most recent was a meta-analysis of depictions of gun violence in the media done here, but focused on national media and mass shootings. So this is why an analysis of local media, we felt, would add to the growing body of research around media and its relationship to public perceptions of gun violence. Our goal was really to examine the role of media in accurately and fairly reporting on issues related to gun violence. So what I'm going to share with you today is parts of the resulting report. And the overall report provides a foundational understanding of racism, white supremacy, and anti-Blackness as it evaluates the impact of media depictions of gun violence and gun policy in Maryland from 2020 to 2024. We are in the process of getting that up on our website, as well as the website of our partners for the work, the Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle, and we'll make sure to send a PDF copy to Progress for distribution to anyone who's interested. So, media depictions of crime, gun violence, and gun policy are not neutral, right? Despite historic veneration of the concept of journalistic objectivity, what is reported or what is omitted from news depictions plays a critical role in shaping public perceptions about how much crime there is, who is committing crimes, and with what motives, and what should be done to address it. Let me ground you in some of the relevant theories and frameworks which we utilize in conceptualizing these depictions of crime, gun violence, gun policy. So, starting with an understanding of what Black people are dealing with. So Black people are suffering from the effects of multiple traumas. And typically in public health, when we speak of an individual who is experiencing multiple traumas, we refer to them as being polyvictimized or experiencing comorbidities. When we speak of the overlapping traumas at the collective or population level, epidemiologists call it a syndemic. So a syndemic or synergistic epidemic is a term used in epidemiology to describe concurrent or sequential epidemics or disease clusters in a population, which typically develop under health disparities. The factors that contribute to a syndemic can be structural, sociocultural, interpersonal, and individual. When utilized to describe the multiple epidemics that Black people in this country have experienced due to trauma, a syndemic is a systematic confluence of multiple traumas on people based in structural and institutional discrimination and stigmatization. So when we think about a syndemic, what we realize is that it exacerbates the problems of Black people here in the United States. And it looks at both health and social ecological disparities and inequalities. And more specifically, the syndemic of injustice was coined to explain how systemic oppression impacts Black people. It was published by myself and my colleague, Tanya Sharp. It describes how our youth, and as well as Black people, but really how it impacts youth, and how they are suffering from the effects of systemic oppression derived from structural and symbolic violence. In the case, the concurrent epidemics are a direct result of anti-Black racism and include structural, symbolic, and interpersonal violence transmitted via intergenerational trauma experienced as a result of both collective and chronic exposure to these epidemics. And what distinguishes this phenomenon as a syndemic, as opposed to intersectionality or comorbidities, is the mutually reinforcing interaction of the conditions which impact Black people as a collective. So this is more than the simultaneous presence of the conditions, but comprised of the structural and sociocultural factors interacting to contribute to the physiological, psychological, and behavioral outcomes that manifest at the population level. However, what we really want to think about is how this undergirds the study, right? So what it does is it looks at structural traumas and structural violence, and the media serves as a tool of structural violence where news depictions of crime, gun violence, and gun policy have been shaped by the nation's history with anti-Black racism. So when journalists cover a news story, they can cover it from various perspectives. And those are referred to as frames by some people. Usage of one frame versus another may influence public perception and opinion of the issue that's being described. So when we're describing incidents of gun violence, some journalists may focus on mental health or gun regulation, while others may emphasize a discussion of gun rights or who has the right to bear arms, right? There is also, you may have heard this term, the if it bleeds, it leads, which is a mentality that has created tension in journalism where profit motives often push against getting the news out there, where the motive is making money, getting more eyes on the story over nuanced and contextualized depictions of why violence happens and how we should address it. This has led to a movement over the past 2 decades or so towards fear-based news programming. And that fear-based news programming grabs the audience's attention while concurrently promoting anxiety. As a result of this type of programming, many people of color, especially Black Americans, find the coverage of Black people and other people of color to be problematic. So journalists have tried to move from portrait to landscape framing. And this reframing is supposed to name the problem, describe the solution, and elevate shared values. So portrait versus thematic or landscape, it's a visual metaphor to explain the impact of gun violence news stories. So there's a distinction that's made between the portrait framing or episodic framing, which centers on an individual person or a particular incidence of gun violence, and the landscape framing, which is sometimes seen as thematic framing, which illustrates this broader context in which individual incidents occur in order to expand the conversation about who is actually responsible for causing and solving the problems. This metaphor is useful to explain the political impact of news frames. The episodic portrait frame centers individuals in the action, creating heroes and victims, and memorializing one dramatic moment. The landscape thematic side shows the larger ecosystem and the systems at play, giving context for the larger structural forces that may determine an individual's actions. So thinking back to history, a portrait of Nat Turner, who stood up against slavery as an enslaved person during chattel slavery, a portrait of Nat Turner attacking someone, right? Framing it as an attack is hard to accurately interpret outside the context of the landscape of slavery. It wasn't an attack. It was someone trying to liberate themselves and others, right? Which way you look at it depends on whether you take a portrait or a landscape framing. Similarly, a portrait of 90s gang violence and uprisings should not be viewed outside the landscape of the undermining of Black social movements that were happening at that time through the counterintelligence program, or the racialized mass incarceration of the war on drugs and government austerity. Historical context serves to explain the implications of these omissions through framing, showing not only what is excluded from the frame, but what is subtly and implicitly represented. Episodic gun violence stories in Maryland come from a long line of region-specific history rooted in anti-Black racial constructs. And many in the extant literature further delineate the real-world impacts of episodic framing for gun violence news stories, while also adding a bit of nuance to the episodic thematic binary. They found that exposure to episodic news stories on gun violence from mainstream media increased concerns about gun violence. But episodic gun violence from conservative media created a deflation effect of sorts, where individuals were less likely to view gun violence as an issue. Adding an analysis of race helps potentially explain these findings. Now, while mainstream stories may not have a deep thematic analysis of structural factors driving violence, they also may lack the sensationalism of implicit racial cues that trigger discourses of racial panic in the audience, thus allowing them to increase desire for gun control when they read them. So more conservative media's episodic news stories may have colorblind cues to dismiss gun violence not only as an individual issue, but as an issue of racial others expressing their innate criminality. And when you frame something that way, it makes the audience less likely to support gun control. and more likely to feel the need to arm themselves to protect themselves from these criminals, and more likely to support over-policing in certain communities. This also demonstrates the value of analyzing, in addition to this episodic thematic binary, the content of the story to see if elements of sensational headlines or pictures may be shaping consumers' responses to these stories. And this leads to an alternative frame for gun violence reporting, and an alternative framework that people have thought about, which is the public health frame. So many of us, I know Progress has promoted this, many of us consider the public health approach to violence prevention. And in 2016, the American Public Health Association was one of the first major institutions to declare gun violence as a public health crisis, citing guns as a key driver of mortality and in need of public health research, surveillance, interventions akin to other fatal diseases. In 2024, the Surgeon General went further and proclaimed gun violence as a public health crisis, which was the culmination of many years of academic and political advocacy. And as you all know, I'm probably talking to the choir at this point, but this was done to shift gun violence from a crime frame focused primarily on moralizing and individualizing themes such as bad guys with guns, and to reflect a multidisciplinary cross-sector approach that combines the work of clinical healthcare providers like those at University of Maryland Shock Trauma, to the, like those who treat victims and survivors, with the work of law enforcement who holds perpetrators accountable, and for researchers as ourselves who try to come up with solutions. So when we utilize this public health lens, gun violence is approached like a communicable disease, with trauma and poverty conceptualized as conditions where an incidence of gun violence is spread to others through mechanisms like retaliation and targeted prevention interventions, such as focusing policing on groups that engage in activity that puts them at increased risk, can be seen as vaccines to inhibit the spread of violence. Now, we have tons of style guides and resources that have come out of this public health frame, this public health approach, that have been used by journalists so that they can shift their crime, gun violence reporting to a public health frame, and to use to make sure that episodic thematic binary doesn't take over and have the issues which I described earlier. And so there have been reports that advocate for both thematic and public health reporting, trying to instruct reporters to steer away from individualizing and victim blaming episodic frame, using that sensationalizing language, move away from reducing victims to data points, and using code words like gritty or urban. These frames instead offer a move towards humanizing journalistic practices, including the use of language like son or father, directing audiences to community resources, and offering solutions that address core drivers of gun violence, like social supports, concentrated poverty, structural racism. This solutions journalism perspective is actually part of a global shift focused on advancing reporting on how people are trying to solve problems and what can be learned from both their successes and failures. And on the screen are the messages we have been taught to consider when speaking about how we can have an impact on violence. They have been discussed and shared throughout many of our work in violence prevention and crime reduction. And until I started engaging the community with this work at the Center for Violence Prevention and really becoming thoroughly community engaged in how we approached everything that we do at the center, I too thoroughly embraced this approach and these messages. However, as I spoke with people, many members of Black and Brown communities here in Baltimore had an issue with this approach. And I'm going to tell you why. So there are problems with public health frames. And in theory, advocating for it makes sense. But what we have recognized is many of the institutions that are advocating for using a public health frame caution against the general use of our public health epidemiological language when talking about gun violence. Because when you use a term like gun violence epidemic, you actually create the same sort of sensationalism, the normalization of gun violence that the public health frame is actually trying to challenge. Indeed, some, like my colleagues at Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle, who were a part of this project, have noted the capacity for the public health frame to actually reflect discourses of racial panic. Because it is not a large leap from saying gun violence is a disease to people saying or interpreting it as Black and Brown communities suffering from gun violence are the disease, which creates the same victim blaming that the public health frame sought to correct. So this goes to show that in addition to noting the distinctions between episodic thematic frames for gun violence, it is very important to have context for what fills this thematic frame when interpreting the impact of the coverage. So what this has all resulted in is harmful reporting of gun violence or community firearm violence. The Philadelphia Center for Gun Violence Reporting and others have operationalized the potential levels of harmful reporting of this gun violence using a social ecological model of health as a framework. And just saying, Joe, I had to cite Philadelphia, so you should be happy. But this organization considered that individuals are nested within their social and physical environments at multiple levels, right? These things we know, neighborhoods, community, society, but harmful reporting of violence, especially gun violence, has adverse effects at each of these levels. And this figure depicts their theorized levels and also potential mechanisms of harm. So the individual level, the firearm injured people or co-victims involved in the shooting that's being reported on, using, harmful reporting has resulted in individuals feeling dehumanized, and it compounds the trauma they may already be experiencing. At the community level, when we think about firearm injured people, co-victims, or anyone who's been affected by previous shootings, the harmful impacts of the media have led to negative perceptions of community safety and further disinvestments from these unsafe, right? Places are unsafe, these bad communities, which actually leads to increased gun violence. And then at the societal level, the news audiences that are viewing or reading or listening to the content and society at large, at this level, the application of the public health frame has unintentionally impacted public perception by reinforcing racist stereotypes about the people and places most impacted by gun violence. This also leads to reliance on policing over community investment, which hinders the truly effective public health responses. And so an understanding of these frameworks and, the history of racial panic, anti-Black racism, relevant theories, and media framing, as we've described, is what led to our current study, which I will spend the rest of my time walking you through that study. So as I mentioned, this is our current project. Our report provides a foundational understanding of the impact of media depictions of gun violence and gun policy. We looked at stories published here in Maryland from 2020 to 2024. So we took a 5-year retrospective. Influenced by the public health model, when you think about the Baltimore News built environment, right? When we're talking about the landscape of news media reporting, we sometimes use the term built environment, and so some people say it's a landscape, the media landscape or the ecosystem, but we tend to lean towards built environment because when you say a landscape or an ecosystem, the media landscape, the media ecosystem, it makes it appear as though that's natural and inevitable rather than the result of intentional decisions around media coverage and corporate consolidation. And so following this trend, I'm going to talk about right now, briefly, the media's built environment here in Baltimore and the Capital Region, to place depictions of gun violence in their proper context and where the Baltimore news environment is coming from. And our news environment has been described as diverse but fragile. Now, at one point, we had 55 outlets in Baltimore alone. However, there was a tendency of the smaller outlets to just reprint information from larger ones, which actually reduces overall media diversity. And so for example, if there was a police involved shooting where what they found was when they looked across those 55 news outlets, roughly 40% of them just repeated the information from either the Associated Press or from legacy outlets like the Baltimore Sun. Moreover, in more recent years, cutbacks have impacted the local news environment, with us noting that the high percentage of stories now are actually initiated by government. Roughly 60% of all stories here in our state are initiated by government, by press releases, by information that is coming from law enforcement or the police. And that has an impact on, and the other reason is also because there's limited journalistic resources. Journalists are having less and less resources, and so the environment is actually shrinking. So in a more recent study of the Baltimore's media's built environment by the local news network, 33 news outlets were listed in Baltimore City and County, and only 2 of them were described as robust, including the Baltimore Sun. The Capital Gazette and the Baltimore Sun are both owned by the same person or by the same group, the Sinclair Broadcasting Group. As a result, the Gazette now tends to repost the Sun stories more than generate new ones. The other newspaper that we looked at for this was the Baltimore Afro-American newspaper, which is one of the oldest Black-owned newspapers, not just in the state, but in the country. And it was started in 1892. It gradually grew from a one-page church paper to a full-fledged newspaper with regional circulation. However, in recent years, the readership of the Afro-American has shrunk. And this is the majority of the newspapers and the information in Baltimore News's built environment comes from these 3 outlets: the Baltimore Sun, the Capital Gazette, which actually reposts mostly Baltimore Sun articles, and the Afro-American news paper. So this is where most people are getting their information from. Now, it is into this context that our study was contextualized. Our goal was to examine the role of the media in accurately and fairly reporting on issues related to gun violence in Maryland. Specifically, we aimed to analyze the media, including, originally we wanted to do radio, print, and local television news, and their depictions of topics related to gun violence throughout the state for 5 years, 2020 to 2024. What ended up happening is just the print media and the 3 outlets that I spoke of earlier. What we have produced is a depiction of, what the media isolates as the causes of gun violence and what is presented as solutions. Our goal was really to compare these depictions with an analysis of a historical understanding of inequality, structural violence, and everything else that I spoke about earlier, and how this influences the media representations. Our particular focus was on isolating consistent themes, like what were the consistent themes that came across in news coverage here, and comparing these depictions to historical tropes that were tied to Black youth, Black families, and anxiety about community control of public safety and public resources. Our analysis concludes with an analysis. What we did, it concludes with an analysis of the political implications of the media depictions, relating them to what is ending up happening here in Maryland as a result of how the news media pushes the narrative. So we did a content analysis of the 3 newspapers. Well, we originally aimed to do all 3. So we developed a search strategy that used the Baltimore Sun's ProQuest database and the Capital Gazette's online database. And we used Boolean operators, mesh terms, for example, gun or weapon or firearm or rifle, and violence or crime or shooting. We initially wanted to run the search in the Afro as well, but their archives are not online searchable at this time. So what we did was, whenever possible, we used the Afro to triangulate some of the articles for comparison. Now, to qualitatively analyze the content of news coverage on gun violence, we developed a coding instrument similar to those used by other researchers for examining framing of gun violence stories. Additionally, that framing, that coding instrument we developed in collaboration with our community partners at Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle, as well as conversations with community members as a whole. Additionally, we aim to examine depictions of victims or perpetrators of gun violence and the communities where gun violence occurs to really evaluate how these depictions differ across the state and examine how they may reflect concerns around sensationalism and racial bias in media coverage of gun violence. We measured whether the news stories identified focused exclusively on a specific act of gun violence or on the general problem of gun violence, and by whom. Specific attention was paid to the framing of event-based, episodic, and thematic news stories as they pertain to race and ethnicity. It was important for us to ascertain how Black people were framed when discussing issues of gun violence in media outlets throughout the state as a whole and in comparison to other races and ethnicities. We also intended to investigate the extent to which news outlet biases manifest in the reporting. So we aimed to do a lot. And like I said, we ended up being limited to 2 major papers that were searchable that unfortunately are owned by the same group, and a group, the Sinclair Broadcasting Group, that has since been found to have a lot of racial biases in their reporting. So we measured the frequency of each type of story. We collected basic demographic factors related to specific acts. We actually planned to use chi-square tests to compare the proportion of news stories and additional factors related to gun violence in event-focused versus thematic news coverage. However, the cell sizes were too small to test those relationships. And as I mentioned, with only 2 papers to report, there was limits on the testing. And so we ended up only reporting frequencies primarily. So we found 2,400 articles. And once we put our inclusion and exclusion criteria, of those 2,400 articles, a total of 253 articles addressed the issue of gun violence as a single event or an ongoing issue. And just to give you a sense of what those other 2,400 articles could be, a lot of them were sports related. So we had a lot of articles, of course, about, the Baltimore Orioles and the Baltimore Ravens. We had a lot of articles, if you think about it, about that were real estate focused, lifestyle. There are a lot of other articles that appear. But once we really got down to it, we had 253 articles and that addressed the issue of gun violence. And nearly 80% of those articles focused on a single incident or event related to gun violence, whereas roughly 20% of the articles focused on gun violence as an ongoing issue. And probably no surprise because of the what I've told you about the 2 main news outlets. The majority of the articles focused on the central and capital region of Maryland, with very little attention to the other surrounding regions of Maryland. And of the articles that address gun violence, the articles inconsistently shared demographics related to age, race, and gender. They were very inconsistent. Some stories included the victim's age, roughly about 45% of when they reported it. Roughly 45% of those reported the victim's ages of 25 years. They also, only about 50% of them reported gender, and when they did, 52% of those were male. And almost all of them omitted race. However, when they did when they I'm sorry, let me say, almost all of them omitted race, but they spoke of, those terms that I said that I said earlier, like urban or gritty. They described the environments, but they didn't name the race. So they weren't race blind. They still used terms that contextualized race in this country and in this state. So of the articles that were included in the review, when we looked at this, an overwhelming majority referenced single incidents or events related to gun violence in the central and capital regions of Maryland. So it primarily focused on Anne Arundel, Baltimore, Baltimore County, Baltimore City, Carroll, Harford, and Howard counties in the central region, and Montgomery, Prince George's, and Frederick counties in the capital regions. Compared to the Capital Gazette, the Baltimore Sun published a greater volume of articles addressing gun violence. In contrast, the Capital Gazette, in addition to the articles that they published republished from the Baltimore Sun, they also relied heavily on Associated Press content rather than locally produced journalism. And there were three predominant themes of the news stories: public safety, public opinion, and politics. The first major theme among the articles, like I said, was public safety. Articles focusing on gun violence involving youth and young adults, victims, appeared to emphasize these types of shooting and gun violence as a public safety issue that garners specific attention and monitoring and surveillance of these communities. Now, while most of these articles may have even started off as describing single and isolated incidents of gun violence, they would often then switch and conclude by reporting statistics and facts that summarize gun violence as an ongoing problem in need of control. For example, a Baltimore Sun article reported a story concerning a single incident of violence involving a mother and her 8-month pregnant daughter who unfortunately were found shot inside a car. Now, while this was an article reporting a single incident of gun violence crime in a Southwest Baltimore City neighborhood, instead of talking about the impact on the family and looking at her family as portrait, the portrait frame, they took this thematic frame, but the conclusions talked about young children killed in recent years by gun violence and assault. They still swung towards public safety and how we have to save the children. Now, public opinion emerged as the second major theme across the articles. Coverage of a single incident of gun violence first frequently centered public mourning, and it might quote community members or activists and families affected by shootings and crime. It used people's grief, their advocacy, pleas for attention, and calls for action, and they used those quotes to tug at people's heartstrings and change public opinion. So, for example, in an article about the ongoing investigation into the killing of a young adult male, the victim's mother stated, "I just wish it would end. I wish they would come up with some kind of solution." And then they say that, the parent believes the police could be stretched thin, and that because they're stretched thin with investigating homicide cases, that's why they're not looking at my son's case. And then the article goes on in terms of swaying public opinion to talking about the number of murders in Baltimore every year. Articles that spotlighted public opinion often overlapped with those emphasizing public safety. So this overlap, underscores how media narratives connect public awareness of safety concerns to calls for greater support and monitoring and community perspectives on institutional responses. Now, the final theme that emerged was politics. Articles with content focused on politics often discussed gun violence as an ongoing concern in relation to political party differences, as well as varying political agendas and enforcements of policies. Additionally, these articles reference specific gun violence campaigns, and some of these campaigns pitted some elected officials against other elected officials and political leaders. So, what does this all mean, right? So using a community-informed, a culturally responsive lens when reporting about gun violence would be more impactful in shifting public opinion about the issue and what can be done, and more viable in developing effective interventions that were actually supported by policy in the overall political landscape. Because whether it's a single event or a thematic focused article, the conclusions ended up primarily being the same and shaped the arguments as either an ongoing problem that ties to public safety and or public opinion, and ultimately presented gun violence as solely a political issue instead of a community issue, with the community having ideas of how to solve it. Most of the articles described an isolated incident with references to the patterns of gun violence as an ongoing crime issue, and then shape the narrative to be a political matter that needs to be controlled or monitored or solved by our legislators. Whether they use the public health frame or a race-neutral lens, the articles actually pointed to the media as a significant contributor in the framing of gun violence as an ongoing problem and serious political issue, warranting surveillance and control, predominantly of those in urban environments or those characterized by low socioeconomic status. Being that those environments tend to disproportionately be Black and Brown communities, these accounts echo anti-Black statements that have existed throughout centuries here in the United States, which reflect racialized anxieties. And with the pejorative framing of these narratives, particularly of young adults, these news depictions continue to perpetuate the concept of racial panic, thereby, unfortunately, having the impact of continuing racial suppression. So I am going to end there, and I will take questions. Just for those of you who are interested, that this particular image is a painting from Faith Ringgold from 1967. It's from her American People series, where she pointed out some of the issues of gun violence and who we see as the perpetrator, as opposed to who may actually be the perpetrator. And so I will stop there.
Thank you so much, Dr. Finigan-Carr. Amazing and insightful presentation. It's just such a pleasure to hear how the work actually panned out from where we started. And we have roughly 10 minutes. I also want to thank you for shouting out Philadelphia. We also we have 10 minutes left before we close, so I'm going to open it up to Q&A.
Mhm. Uh-oh.
Nadine, while the community is reflecting on its and digesting the incredible scholarship and breadth of wonderful information, and parenthetically, Joe's not the only one from Philadelphia, so we both were brought up on cheesesteaks and hoagies, and soft pretzels. But let me start us off with. Tragically, we know that reporting in the media, intentional or unintentional, is biased across the continuum. And parenthetically, it appears that even today it's more biased. And it's under attack. I mean, even though we celebrate the First Amendment, it appears to be under attack in so many different dimensions. But you very thoughtfully identify the problem, the concern, the issue, and frankly, the untoward consequences. Information, facts, data, is at the heart of public health. Um, um, so the question is, and it's a big question, how do we take the thoughtfulness, the science, the reflection that you've put together, and how do we connect with media outlets? And there's multiple, and frankly, some now even pride themselves on being biased, if you will. But how do we incorporate the reflections that you've thoughtfully investigated into practice, into the outlets that, I even use the word informing us in quotes these days, because I think we're all struggling with what's fact, what's fiction, what's a distortion. But how do we get to the media outlets to incorporate the thoughtfulness that you've investigated?
So there's a paradigm shift, I would say, that's going on across how we're approaching gun violence and representations of how we think about, frame the issue in a way that actually addresses it and provides input from community members. And there's that on one side. There is a shift by certain outlets, not necessarily outlets that are getting the amount of dollars, that larger groups like Sinclair Broadcasting Group. But I think about outlets like the Baltimore Banner and some of the smaller outlets. And just a side note, we didn't include the Baltimore Banner because they didn't have 5 years worth of articles yet. They're still relatively new. So there's this shift towards, I think the Baltimore Banner, I think even, and we wanted to limit it to our region. So we didn't look at some of the larger national outlets that also are taking deeper dives into stories that are doing more than just the binary episodic thematic. And also, as I mentioned, even when we use the public health frame, to be careful how we use the public health frame, right? So there are stories that are coming out now that take a deeper dive. They also are the stories that when you open up a news outlet online to read it, as opposed to the hard copy of the paper, and I should have brought it upstairs. I actually still get hard copies of the Afro. So, but when you see the online version of some of these, at the top of the news story, it'll say something like, it will take 2 minutes to read this article, or it will take 13 minutes to read this article. And when you want to give it a deep dive, those are the ones that take 13 minutes, 15 minutes. They're not, a quick one and done. And so it's part of it really is there are journalists out there that are taking this deep dive and are being intentional. The issue actually on the flip side of it is the audience who's reading it, whether or not people are taking that 13 minutes as opposed to 2 minutes to read the article. And going back to that, if it bleeds, it leads mentality, it's also the shorter the better, because people have short attention spans mentality that's going around, right? If I can read it in 2 minutes, or even better, if you can convert it into a TikTok or a reel or something that I can just give me the highlights and I'm done, that's what I'm seeing. And I think that's also, even when people want to give it the full shrift that it needs, what we're getting is misinformation, is people who don't have the deep dive understanding try to translate that for the social media generation. And I think that is as and I'm not a journalist, but I play one on TV, and I do, guest host a radio show that has a journalistic and historical focus. But what I think is, when we are doing reporting, we've got to figure out, how do we translate this for people who no longer think the way we do? And I no longer want to read deeply and want to unfortunately rely on either someone else to explain it for them or a video, or I hate to say this, but AI to give them the Cliffs Notes. Back in my day, when people use Cliff Notes, you would literally joke, like, talk about them. Like, you couldn't just read the book. You gotta get the Cliffs Notes. What's
Yeah.
wrong with you? Now people are using AI to give them summaries or Cliff Notes or fake podcasts that turn the article into a podcast so they can listen to it, and not actually doing the deep dive. So we've got to really think about it. How do we get people to look at the whole frame and not just the 2-minute Cliff Notes?
So we have three questions in the Q&A. I don't know if we can squeeze them in 6
Okay.
minutes, but we'll try to fast track it. The first question is, based on your study, how does the right-wing politics of the executive chairman of Sinclair Media, David Smith, impact their depictions of gun violence, particularly in relation to youth?
Um, he drives the conversation. David Sinclair drives the conversation. He and to the point where there are, and like I said, I'll send the report, but there are examples where he specifically talks about having his reporters chase down Adrian Jones, the former Speaker of the House here from Maryland, or talk specifically to Ivan Bates and people of that nature to and harasses them until they either say something that's more aligned with his views, or he challenges them to the point where they're worried about being reelected. He drives the narrative for the Baltimore Sun and the Capital Gazette, and it has an impact on what we see, what we understand, and what the perspective of those media outlets are. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, next question. From your evaluation of the articles, did journalists demonstrate differences in reporting when the victim or perpetrator was a racial minority compared with the racial majority? For example, were racial majority victims more often framed sympathetically, while racial minority victims were more likely to be described through markers such as being hardworking, employed, or law-abiding?
So the thing is, and this was actually part of the problematic part that we found, is they actually didn't report the race, but they did do those, for lack of a better term, dog whistles of, this was a hardworking individual that was struck down in their prime. And when they had conversations like that, they focused on the person. They might not have named the race, but they focused on, this person. And but when it was probably a Black person, because then they named the community, they named the neighborhood, and then they used terms like urban and gritty, and this was a part of the problem because of poverty in this community, or most people in this community don't have high school diplomas, or they frame it in a negative light. And so they do this without actually saying this was a Black victim or this was a white victim. And they think they're being colorblind, but instead they're actually perpetuating the tropes that they thought they were trying to eliminate.
And just to be respectful of time, I'm going to squeeze in this last question. I don't think it'll take long for you to respond. Were there demographic differences in who received media coverage as victims or perpetrators?
Being that law enforcement seemed to tip almost all of these stories off, the demographic differences were more in the police officer that was giving, that they were quoting, and less in the perpetrator. We know that there were probably demographic, but they didn't report that. It was very, the lengths that these articles went to try to not say race while saying race for both victims and perpetrators was absolutely ridiculous. I mean, bending over backwards, but still blaming them regardless of race. And the one thing that I will say is what really got me was they focused more on homicide than suicide, which is, we were looking at gun violence. We didn't say only homicides. The majority of the articles were focused on homicide versus suicide. And when you think about Maryland's violent death reporting system, the most recent numbers actually show they were equal, and now we're showing more suicides in Maryland than homicides, but the articles only focused on the homicides. And the articles primarily focusing on the regions and the counties that they did, also then eliminated areas where long guns and issues of, related to other types of weapons were used in among other types of populations in predominantly white neighborhoods, communities, and counties. So.
Thank you. I have like 3 pages of notes of questions that I personally want to ask you, and I'll ask you those offline. I just
Sure.
want to thank you so much for such an impactful and insightful study. I really do. And on that note, Dr. Kessel will take us out. But thank you again, Dr. Finnegan-Carr. It's
Thank
amazing.
you.
Nadine, on behalf of Progress, and in particular our hardworking students, Charlotte Knight, and our Research Associate Director, Barbara Singer, we thank you for not only, frankly, underscoring the word. We've labeled this as Distinguished Speaker Event. And indeed, I think you exceeded in that distinguished event by I'm going to use your word, framing incredible dimensions of this challenge, and not the least of which is you talked about the public health frame, but even the public health frame is now, frankly, under direct assault as we threaten the value of science and vaccines. And it's just building an incredible challenge for all of us to promote public safety, to save lives, and saving lives, stopping the gunshot, stopping the trigger pull, but also vaccinating. We used to call vaccination shots, but we've changed that language too a little bit to temper this. But just again, I want to thank our staff and Nadine, thank you for being part of a family and trying to contribute science to save lives. And
Thank you
thank
for
all of you
having
for
me.
listening in the community. And we'll be in touch, and we're going to continue this effort and try to bring scholars to all of us, as many of our friends and colleagues are doing. So thank you all today. And again, a big, big, big hug, and thank you, Nadine, for doing such a beautiful job.
Thank you.
Thank you.